Hey, everyone, and welcome to the Invisible Obvious podcast, a place for curiosity conversations to explore the impact of actions and inactions in our daily lives. I'm your host, Daniel Paulus, and today I have the pleasure to talk with Josh Stanton. Josh and I met about 12 years ago through an organization we were both working with, and we remained in contact ever since. He's a fascinating guy, so I can't wait to have this conversation on multiple levels. But Josh, thanks for joining me, and I love to let people have an opportunity to introduce themselves and kind of talk about how they've got to where they're at in their professional life. Now, for you, that's going to involve some personal stuff. You got an amazing wife. I know you're going to lace into that story, but tell us, a little bit how you got where you started and where you're at right now.
Absolutely. So I'm the rabbi at East End Temple in Manhattan. I also am director of leadership at CLAL, which is the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. And when I'm not doing stuff at either of those organizations, I am reading and writing because I love to study the question of why people absolutely adore being Jewish and do not like most Jewish organizations. And so my recent book, Awakenings, is all about transformations happening in leadership and belonging, and in the way that we understand ourselves as Jews. And the forthcoming book is about the parallels between the American Jewish experience, what a lot of other religious leaders are saying, that, wow, my flock is getting smaller, but it doesn't mean that their yearnings are going away. It might just mean that we're not serving them as well as we might. So suffice it to say, I'm a troublemaker. Yes, I owe a lot of my story to my wife. I owe a lot of my story to incredible mentors, including you. I owe a lot of my story to an amazing mentor in college who saw my potential as a religious leader and was not himself Jewish, was the Reverend Dr. Paul Sorrentino, an evangelical pastor. And so I am a really lucky person who gets to learn from people all the time. So can't wait for this conversation.
Well, I love that take to start with, and I had the incredible honor to be at your ordination, which was very moving, and to see you, have gone through formation up to that point, and then take on this leadership role, because it really is that. A religious leader has several responsibilities. I got to ask as a side note, what do the members of your congregation call you? How do they address you? Is it Rabbi Stanton? Is it Josh? I'm just curious.
So I always introduce myself as Josh. That creates some problems because sometimes people don't realize that I'm the rabbi until much later. And so that creates its own funny moments. I don't introduce myself as rabbi for a very selfish reason. That when someone calls me on the phone or in person and they say, Rabbi, it's a signal to me that they need me to take care of them, that they need me because there's something pastoral going on that is of great urgency in their lives. And I am better able to serve them when they identify very specifically the capacity in which they need me. And so I just go by Josh most of the time. I don't like the idea of hiding behind my title. And when people call me by it, it means something very specific, and it means I need to change modes into a caretaking mode.
That's wonderful. I hadn't thought about it that way. I've been reading a lot about generational differences lately, and I wonder if that has something to do with it too. Like the younger generations want more informality, right? So do you find that with the members of your congregation that some of the younger people just are not comfortable with calling you by a title, or some of the older people really want to call you by a title to formalize the relationship, or how has that played out for you? Because what will you be, a millennial?
I'm a millennial, so I'm
Okay.
37 years old, born in the great year of 1986, and so am, an anti-authority, accidental person in a leadership position. So if part of this is probably me navigating my own stuff with respect to leadership roles and hierarchy. A lot of it is that people have baggage when it comes to religious leaders. So when they think of the title rabbi, the last rabbi they might have encountered could be someone who rejected them, could be someone who turned them away as somehow not authentically Jewish enough, or scolded them, or was the one who taught the dullest class in Hebrew school. And so in stepping away from the title and saying, I'm an individual who's going to try to play an important role in your life, we can define healthy community and pastoral relationships without some of the emotional baggage that goes with it.
Well, when I saw you in New York, I was telling you I was going to work on this conversation with you, and I'm really looking forward to this next part of it, which is I'm trying to explore two main ideas, Josh, as it relates to leadership in general. The first is integration. Okay. So I'd like you to speak to that as both a leader and what you've seen in other leaders that you've worked with, and also perhaps from a spiritual perspective, right? Because I don't want to assume that the listeners are going to know what the pursuit of integration means from a spiritual perspective in this conversation. So, first of all, take us down the leadership role, because you've worked with some and been around some pretty amazing and accomplished leaders in your journey so far.
So I want to bring both together, the leadership and the spiritual, because in my experience, the two are deeply connected. So
Okay.
the Hebrew term for integration, at least as I would translate it, is charuz, which means the weaving together of different strands that exist into a coherent whole. And the idea actually originates from a style of biblical commentary where you take a direct quote and then you figure out what every single word in that quote might mean. You sort of deconstruct the quote and then you reweave it. You don't just leave it in tatters on the floor. Then you weave it back together with new understandings of the relationship between each word. And I think the same exact process happens for us as leaders, where we look at all of the different strands of leadership. So, what has my day been so far? I had some logistical and administrative tasks. I responded to multiple pastoral calls that were pressing in nature. I took a voice lesson because we have a new cantor who sings beautifully, and it's pretty clear that I'm just not up to snuff right now. I did some writing because I'm trying to write some op-eds and get some ideas out there. I studied the Torah portion because I want to speak meaningfully about this week's Torah portion from the Bima. So there are all of these disparate strands, and in my mind, the essence of leadership is being able to talk about the way in which all of them relate to each other, because no strand stands alone. And when I talk to the most effective leaders I know, it might mean that they're sort of B plus players in a lot of different areas, but they understand the whole that creates. And a lot of people who are extraordinary in just one dimension, if they can't integrate that ability with other related abilities, it doesn't mean much. I mean, you think of a baseball player who can hit but can't do anything else. They can't slide. They can't steal bases. They can't read pitches. They can't catch balls. They can't do a lot of other things. They might still not play in the pros. You have to have multiple skills. Some you're invariably going to have in spades and others not. But the key is bringing them together so you are one coherent baseball player, one coherent rabbi, one coherent lawyer. And I think that holds true both in very specific leadership roles and in life more broadly, because I'm different at home as a result of being a rabbi. And other people are different in their home lives as a result of being whatever they might seek to be. So it is an illusion that our professional lives and other parts of our lives are separate. The weave extends to all aspects.
That's so well said, Josh. And that's part of what I'm trying to get at in this work, I think, is how well do leaders understand where they're at on that spectrum, right? So you've got a lot of people, you've met them, I've met them, that are really good at one thing, which is great. And it's probably gotten them a long way even to get their leadership role, right? Because, they're a great fundraiser, they're a great presenter, they're usually good out front with people and relationships. The challenge I've found is then when you scratch a little deeper and you get into higher level strategy, they may not have the skill or the interest to want to go to the next level. This is doubly true in some ways in the religious world, right? I mean, and a lot of people would go back and say, well, I wasn't trained for that. So, for instance, you've got a lot of priests I know that are having to do jobs that they weren't trained for in seminary. But guess what? That's the world we're living in right now. And the best ones I have found have been the ones that have acknowledged what their weaknesses are, have done the work like you're trying to do to level up, but have also been able to designate in a confident way to the people that they're partnering with and not be threatened by that. So have you found that to be the case as well?
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, a collaborative work environment is essential, and speaking openly and regularly about your deficits as a leader is an essential part of leadership. I think one of the challenges is that what we describe as leadership in our society, I would not describe as leadership. What we're describing as leadership is really a combination of charisma and sometimes the ability to fundraise and sometimes the ability to present a brand new idea. Those are more presentational skills. And while sometimes correlated with leadership in the sense of management, in the sense of implementing the vision that you lay forth, in the sense of being able to pull together the pieces, some of the time we really get let down by our leaders because what we're saying is our entertainers, or the people who inspire us, the inspirational speakers, we're conflating with genuine leaders. And politics reinforces this because in the pre-TV era, you had people who really got legislation done. That's what made a good politician is they could bring home the pork, or I'm a nice Jewish boy, so bring home the tofu or the kosher chicken to their local district. And if they were great at speaking in an inspiring way, that's wonderful, but they needed to actually legislate. That was the skill set. Why are we getting so little done in Congress? Yes, polarization is unfortunate. It's also we're selecting elected officials who don't know how to legislate necessarily, but who are elected because they're great presenters. And the same is true among rabbis, right? Why am I hired? I'm hired because I can give a good sermon. But what about the other 98% of my job that is not on the bima? What if I can't listen well? What if I can't show up at the hospital and be a supportive presence? What if I can't do strategic planning? What if I don't know how to read a spreadsheet and can't meet my budget, so my nonprofit is suffering year after year? What if I can't do HR? What if I can't teach Torah to someone who's not already an ordained rabbi themselves? So once again, it's sort of the iceberg effect, where we're looking for what's above the surface. It's it's that which is below the surface that matters far, far more.
Here. And, this isn't easy work. What it takes is the next part I want to talk about is accountability, right? Personal accountability to understand what your strengths and weaknesses are, but also to then want to grow and go deeper in that. So I want to ask you about accountability in a couple ways too. Number one, how have you held yourself accountable in your role as a leader, and accountable both as a leader and a family man, right? That's a balance that many people are trying to make. I think it's sad when you've got wonderfully successful, powerful leaders who have traded off their family life entirely, and they're miserable. They're making millions of dollars and they're getting lots of press and attention, but they're not necessarily very happy with what's going on the rest of their life. So now I'm making an assumption here that people want a balanced life and a healthy life. Maybe not everybody does, or they don't know they do. But I'd love to hear you talk about accountability and walk it out in kind of a metaphor as it would be at the temple, right? So you have a staff, and how does the process work for you guys when you're trying to get something done?
Yeah. So, first of all, it's figuring out what people's goals are. And it starts with me listening, not just presenting my own vision and goals. What are people on my staff really excited about? How does that relate to what I'm hearing in the community? How does that relate to what I'm hearing on the board? So you have multiple layers of leadership. And it's how do we connect these? What are the intersections? What are the overlaps and interest between the staff, the board, and the community at large? And all of it is predicated on 1,000 cups of coffee or whatever it might be, sitting down and getting to know people so that I'm constantly getting feedback and input from them on their experience in the community. If they're unhappy, I'm the first person they call, not the last. And so we create a culture of accountability, first through relationship, second, by me expressly talking about things that I don't think are going so well in my own leadership and in general in the community, so people feel that they have permission. And third, focusing on a solutions-driven approach. Everyone wants to be a critic these days. Everyone is so excited. I think we practice on social media just slamming each other. It's, oh, Dan Paulus, when he had that rabbi on, it was just the dullest podcast ever. Like, ugh. And no one's saying, hey, instead of having that rabbi guy, I know an amazing imam who would have so much to say on these topics. Let me introduce you. So everyone's excited to slam it. No one's excited to actually build on it. So what I ask of my staff constantly, first, they need to be know people. I get really excited by ideas. If I have a person, an idea, and a funder, chances are I'm often running before I've like sat down to think for 2 seconds about whether or not it's worth doing, even with a person, an idea, and a funder. So their job is to say, wait, let's think about how this relates to everything else. Two, I need proximity of feedback. If you tell me after 6 months of horrible sermons that you are getting egregiously offended by every word that comes out of my mouth at public events and gatherings and religious ceremonies, why was I sitting there for 25, 26 Shabbats offending you? Please tell me at the very first one that something I said bothered you. So I need immediate feedback or proximate feedback. I need people to tell me to slow down, and I need people to give me solutions. So just saying, I hate your sermons, Rabbi, that does not turn me into a good orator. It just makes me self-conscious. So I need people to give me very precise feedback so that I can actually operationalize it. But once you create a culture of accountability and feedback and continual exchange of ideas, it actually gets to be really easy. And the underlying assumption that I as a leader have to have is that I do not have the answers. I certainly don't have all of them. I would even submit I don't have most of them. That a synagogue as an organization is so complicated that if I'm understanding 20% of what's going on in the community, that's heroic. And so I need to walk around with the assumption that someone can teach me something about the other 80% going on in the community, because surely I'm missing it, and surely I don't want to get blindsided by it. And failure mode one for religious leaders is to try to be the sage on the stage who pontificates and tells everyone how the world works, when at best we're missing 80%, not just of how the world works, but how the world works for our very people. And so you have to have enough confidence to know all that you don't know, and enough arrogance to be able to engage with your own weaknesses because you know you've got enough that's good to offer, and enough humility that you're willing to actually hear the critiques and not just see them as personal attacks, but recognize that every critique, there was a quote I read the other day, every critique is a wish unfulfilled. And so what if we actually heard the criticism not as, I dislike you, Josh, or I dislike you, Paul, or I dislike you, Dan, or I dislike you, Ibrahim, whatever it might be. Wish that they're presenting with love, with lack of polish perhaps, but desire to actually realize the wish with you. That would
That's
mean a lot.
Yeah, that again, that's so well said. And this is what I've loved about watching your journey um, into leadership and your personal journey. That humility piece is so important. And I think that's hard in today's society because we're all self-promoting like crazy on social media, for instance. I mean, there's a huge downside to that. It's a tool, it's a platform, but we get stuck in this cycle of promote, 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 promote. It's me, 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 me. It's There's just huge ramifications to that, as you know well, and we're living it out, regularly. Um, so something you said at the end there is also of interest to me, and that is, where do you feel the most vulnerable, especially as a leader? You've been very forthcoming in saying you don't have all the answers, and I think that's hugely helpful because you're not self pedestalizing yourself. You're saying, let's be in conversation, right? I'm here to help you. I have a job to do. Help me do the job better. But is there something that keeps you up at night, or something where you just feel like, this is something that is of interest to me, and I feel vulnerable in this place.
So I'll answer. I mean, I could keep going for a while. Maybe I'm
Yeah,
a very insecure rabbi, or whatever it might be. But I'm always worried about what I'm not seeing and what I'm missing. And the hardest thing for me as a clergy person is that what I perceive to be a small issue can boil over very quickly. And if I don't observe and pay attention to issues early on, the cleanup is much messier and more difficult. And so I'm always worried about what is it? What are my blind spots right now? What am I missing? What have people not told me? What is going to catch up to us this year? And so that for me is the scariest. It's also transitioning between roles. Rabbis play a lot of different roles. I'm teacher, I'm counselor, I'm pseudo academic or thinker, someone who's supposed to represent the community in quasi political, but certainly public roles. There are a lot of different roles. And where I stumble, and most religious leaders I know stumble, is in transitioning between roles. So literally getting off the bima, getting away from the podium after services and going to what's called oneg in Hebrew, but correlation, where you go, you have a bite to eat, you talk to people, and invariably some people want to socialize and some people want to tell me about what's going on in their lives in a much more therapeutic way. And I've just been in presentation mode. That I think is the what I term the deadliest hour in the life of a rabbi, is like making it through correlation, saying hi to people, spending time when you have all of your thoughts at play in presenter mode, and you really need to be listening most carefully. And there's so many different people who need you at the same moment, it winds up getting really messy.
Yeah, well, I got to see you in that actual mode when I visited you at the temple. There was a social hour going on, and the kids were having ice cream, and the parents were there, and you were introducing me to people, and people were tapping you on the shoulder. So, I mean, it's a sensory overload in some ways, right? I mean, because to your point, you've got to transition, but you also want to be available. But you're a human being too, right? So you've got a lot going on in your head, and again, I think what I admire about you is you stick to the humility piece and you don't pretend. You're not one of those fake it till I make it people. You're like a constant learner and acknowledging what you do know and trying to share that in a empathetic way. You don't use your intellect as a weapon, and we're in a very weaponized society right now around ideas. And I wanted to ask you, so you've kind of intimated this, but this is another huge concern I'm seeing is we need to revisit what language means because everything is so loaded today, right? So I want to let you go off on that a little bit. I know you could talk about it from the context of, Hebrew and the wisdom that's been around for centuries and how you value wisdom, how you value the language itself. But what is your take on what's going on in society today in terms of just how we're using language with each other?
I want to go back to a quote that I had put under my name at my ordination. It's Shma ha'emet me'mi she'amra. Hear truth from whatever source it comes. And the implication is not just people you agree with are going to have truth to share. And not just people you like are going to have truth to share. And a lot of people get really upset when they hear that I'm willing to read outside of a narrowly defined canon. They're like, Rabbi, why are you reading in this political spectrum and not that political spectrum? Rabbi, why are you reading people who are so critical of Israel? Rabbi, why are you listening to Wagner? He was an anti-Semite. Why are you
Hmm.
reading Heidegger? He was a Nazi. Why are you? And at the end of the day, I don't have to like or excuse or extol people who do really terrible things. But if I can learn from them, then their horrific actions are not entirely a waste of breath. And it's my job to listen really carefully to the voices and the perspectives that really get my goat, because my job is to learn far and wide. And what I lament in the way we talk, by the way, to each other and about each other, is we're so ready to write each other off. And cancel culture doesn't work with Jewish tradition. There's an assumption that human beings are fundamentally good, are fundamentally flawed, and are fundamentally capable of positive change. So rather than saying someone said one thing that bothered me, I'm never going to hear from them again, Our job is to figure out how we can support their growth and change so that maybe we can listen to them more easily in the future. And even if we don't want to have a relationship with a person or excuse their conduct in public, what can I still learn from them, even if I'm appalled by their leadership or their role in the world?
And you had a wonderful opportunity to do this recently. Interesting thing came up with a Broadway show that asked you to come in and talk about some of the anti-Semitism they were experiencing. So why don't you share that metaphor a little bit? I'll say the show is called Parade, and you can tell us what it's about. It was a very moving piece of theater, but just give us a little story of how you brought into that and what you were asked to do to help that cast.
So I was honored to be brought in alongside the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis to give context and support around the very strong reactions that actors and others who were part of the company were having about the content of the show, which was about the lynching of a Jewish man and the start of kind of the movement by American Jews to protect themselves and each other, and the creation of Jewish institutions that could really protect American Jews and ultimately helped seed the civil rights movement and partner in the civil rights movement and help to change wider society as well. What was so painful is that there were Jewish cast members playing white supremacists. There were
Mm.
black cast members who were watching every day on stage the lynching of a Jewish man, which was basically an art perfected on black people and then implemented against a Jewish person. And there was a problem in the telling of the story that was actually ahistorical, where the fall person, the person who is ultimately deemed to be responsible in the play, is a black man. And by the way, historically, not the case. It was a white lynch mob.
Mm.
Historically, a black man had nothing to do with the underlying issues that led to a really horrible situation. And so black cast members and Jewish cast members and cast members from across traditions and backgrounds were hurting very differently. And the job that Jackie and I had was not to do comparative pain, not to talk about whose pain was more real or whose pain was bigger, but to create more space so that everyone in their own way could talk about what hurt them, what the show meant to them, what it was like when they were protested by white supremacists at a show about white supremacists lynching a Jewish person. And so our job was to create more space than they would have had otherwise. And it was an incredible blessing to see these remarkable leaders in theater grappling with big ethical questions. The reality is all of us need more space to feel, to think, to integrate, to struggle.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Josh. So my last question for you, and this segues perfectly. We must know each other well because our conversation flows so well. What are you hopeful about? Okay, it is kind of crazy out there right now. I guess depending on how you look at it, there's a lot of divisiveness, a lot of anger, a lot of polarization. Seeing all that still, what are you hopeful about?
I'm so hopeful for a decline in violence worldwide. Now, that sounds kind of ridiculous, right? There's a war in Ukraine. There are constant fights happening all over the place. There's gun violence, there's crime, there's social division, there's all kinds of stuff happening. But Steven Pinker's book, Our Better Angels, was really remarkable in saying that the violence to which the average person is exposed in the course of their lifetimes has never been lower than it is today.
Mm.
That it used to be that every person just saw, the rates of violence at home, what was seen as normal, the rates of violence in the streets, what was seen as normal, the amount of war, and the idea that most people were trained for the military in some form or fashion. It's a beautiful and honorable profession as it exists today in the United States. But how beautiful is it that not everybody has to be a soldier? And I'm very hopeful that violence is in decline. because it implies what is a deeply held Jewish belief that people are fundamentally good, that the world can get better and might actually be getting better, even though there are so many sources of pain. So what it makes me wonder is whether the amount of pain in the world is increasing or whether it is our awareness and our empathy that is actually increasing. That we are more keenly aware and more hurt by the violence and the suffering that exists than we ever have been before. And if that is the case, the world might be going in an okay direction after all.
Well, Josh, we could talk for hours, but I'm gonna call it today with you. And I am so grateful that we've remained friends. And again, it's an honor to see you continue to grow and explore and learn and lead. And people like you give me hope moving forward. So thank you for making this time, and we'll be interested to see how people respond to it. I appreciate you very much.
I am so grateful.